It was a typical busy morning at the airport. Emma, a flight attendant with several years of experience, was preparing for her shift. She moved quickly, checking over her uniform, making sure everything was in place. Today was no different from any other, at least that's what she thought. Her job was demanding. Long hours, constant interaction with passengers, and little time to herself. She liked it that way, kept her busy, kept her mind focused. But the airport was crowded today, and the noise and movement were a little overwhelming. People rushing past her, the loud announcements echoing through the terminals. It was all part of the job. Near the gate, Emma noticed a man sitting alone. He looked out of place. His clothes were torn and dirty. His face was covered in stubble, and his hair was unkempt. A homeless man. Emma sighed, feeling an uncomfortable sense of impatience rise within her. She had seen him before, and just like always, he was sitting there, waiting. He didn't belong here. Emma shook her head and turned back to her task. She had other things to focus on. People to help, flights to prepare. A few minutes later, Emma was walking toward the gate when she saw the homeless man again. This time, he was standing near the counter, looking lost. He had that same tired, defeated look in his eyes. He glanced at Emma, his eyes soft, but there was something desperate about him. "Excuse me," he said quietly, his voice rough from lack of use. "Could you spare some change? Or maybe a little food?" Emma paused for a moment, her gaze flicking to the man. She felt a sharp irritation rising in her chest. There were always people like him, people who thought they could just ask for help without offering anything in return. She was busy, and she had passengers to deal with. With a slight roll of her eyes, she shook her head. "Sorry, I can't help you," she replied, her tone cold and dismissive. The man didn't argue. He didn't try to press her further. Instead, he simply nodded and stepped back as though he had expected the answer. His shoulders slumped, and he turned slowly to walk away. Emma watched him for a moment, still feeling that irritation bubbling inside her. She didn't care about his story. It wasn't her job to take care of people like him. He had made his choices, and now he was just a nuisance. She turned back to the counter, moving on with her work, trying to ignore the nagging feeling in her stomach. A few hours later, Emma's shift was in full swing. The airport was busier now, and she was managing a long line of passengers. As she handed out boarding passes, she couldn't help but notice the homeless man again. He was sitting in the same spot, staring blankly at the floor, his hands resting on his lap. He hadn't moved much, but it seemed like he was waiting for something. Or someone. Then, out of the corner of her eye, Emma saw him approach again. He walked slowly toward her counter, his head down. She sighed, irritated that he was getting in the way of her work once more. This time, she wasn't going to let him off easily. "Excuse me," Greg mumbled, his voice quieter than before. "I don't mean to bother you, but if you have anything to spare, maybe a little food? Or even a drink." Emma looked at him, her patience running thin. He was standing too close now, his worn shoes scuffing against the floor, and his smell was starting to reach her. She felt her irritation grow. "Do you ever stop asking?" Emma snapped, her voice cutting through the air. "Why don't you just find a job like the rest of us? Maybe if you didn't sit around all day begging for handouts, you wouldn't be in this mess." The words came out sharper than she had intended, and for a brief second, she could see the hurt flash across his face. But before she could even think to apologize, Greg's eyes lowered again. He simply nodded, his lips trembling slightly. Without saying another word, he turned and walked back to his corner, disappearing into the crowd. Emma felt a strange, bitter satisfaction for a moment. She had set him straight. Or so she thought. As Emma continued to handle her passengers, the noise of the airport around her felt like a blur. She was used to the constant chatter, the beeping of boarding calls, the shuffle of people moving from gate to gate. But today, something felt off. Her mind kept drifting back to the homeless man, Greg. She couldn't shake the image of his downcast eyes, the way he had silently taken her harsh words. Her shift was nearly over when she overheard two other airport workers talking near the break room. She wasn't eavesdropping on purpose, but their conversation was hard to ignore. They were talking about Greg, the homeless man who had asked her for help earlier. "He's been here for a while now, you know," one of the workers said. "But no one knows his real story. People think he's just another bum." The other worker nodded. Yeah, but they don't know. He used to be a big deal. Ran his own company. Had everything. Emma paused. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. She leaned in slightly, trying to catch every word. Really? The first worker asked. What happened to him? The second worker sighed. He had a bad accident a few years ago. Hurt his back, and it pretty much ruined his whole life. Lost his business. Lost his family. It's a shame. He's not like the others. He's been through things you wouldn't even believe. Emma felt a strange weight in her chest. She didn't understand. How could someone like him, someone who used to have so much, end up like this? The conversation continued, but Emma was no longer listening. She couldn't stop thinking about Greg's life. She remembered the look in his eyes when he asked her for help. It wasn't the look of someone who was lazy or entitled. It was the look of someone who had been broken, someone who had lost everything. She felt a pang of guilt. She hadn't seen him for who he really was. And now, she felt embarrassed. Was she really that quick to judge? The rest of Emma's shift seemed to drag on. The airport felt louder, more crowded, and she couldn't stop thinking about Greg. His quiet presence, his eyes, haunted her. She glanced over at him once more. He was still sitting in his usual spot, now even more isolated as the hours passed. She hadn't realized how much of an impact the conversation between the workers had on her until she found herself staring at Greg. She had assumed that homeless people were lazy, that they had somehow chosen their fate, but the truth was much different than she had imagined. As she glanced at him again, she noticed something she hadn't before. His hands were rough, calloused, as if they had once been used to build or create something. His coat, though torn and frayed, was well worn with age, not something someone who had just fallen into hard times would wear. It spoke of a past life, a different time. He wasn't just some random person off the street. Emma began to pay more attention to him, watching how the people around him acted. Others glanced at him with pity or disdain, but there was something different about how Emma saw him now. It wasn't just about the way he looked, it was about the way he carried himself. Despite everything, he didn't show anger, didn't ask for more than he needed. He just sat quietly with dignity, even though he had nothing left. The more Emma thought about it, the more her heart hurt. How many times had she judged people based on their appearances or circumstances? How many times had she assumed she knew everything about someone just by looking at them? Greg's story was one of loss, yes, but it was also a story of resilience. He had survived, even after losing everything. She couldn't imagine what that must have been like. She began to feel guilty for how she had treated him earlier. He had asked her for help, not because he wanted to inconvenience anyone, but because he needed something, anything to survive. And she had treated him like he was nothing more than a burden. The thought made her stomach turn. Emma felt her heart soften, and she knew she had to make things right. She couldn't just go on pretending that the way she treated people didn't matter. She had judged Greg, but she hadn't even given him a chance to show who he really was. And now, she wanted to change that. Later that afternoon, just as Emma was finishing up her work, she overheard the older man she had seen sitting near Greg earlier. He was talking to one of the airport staff, and Emma found herself drawn to the conversation once again. She had to know more. The older man caught her attention when he mentioned Greg's name, and without meaning to, Emma stepped a little closer, trying to hear more. You know, most people here don't know the real story behind that guy, the older man said, shaking his head. They think he's just some homeless person, but he's not. Not by a long shot. Emma's heart skipped a beat. She wanted to hear everything, and this time, she wasn't going to ignore it. The man sighed, glancing over at Greg, who was still sitting in his corner, looking far older than he probably was. He wasn't always like this. He used to be a big businessman, ran his own company for years, had a family, a beautiful house, the works. He had everything. Emma felt a lump form in her throat. She couldn't believe it. The man she had been so quick to judge, the one she had treated with such indifference, had once lived a completely different life. She had no idea, but it all changed in an instant. The older man continued. He had a terrible accident, one that left him physically and emotionally scarred. He broke his back and couldn't work anymore. He had to sell his company. He couldn't take care of his family the way he had before. They left him, just like that. Emma's heart ached as she processed what she was hearing. She had assumed that Greg had been homeless for a long time, that he had somehow chosen this life. But hearing his story, hearing how he had lost everything in a matter of moments, made her realize how wrong she had been. He lost everything, the older man went on. His business, his family, his dignity. And yet, here he is, still trying to get by, still kind. He doesn't ask for much. Just a little help when he can, and a smile when he's lucky. Emma could feel the weight of the words sinking in. She had been so quick to judge Greg, assuming that he was just another person who had given up. But now she realized how wrong she was. He wasn't a failure. He was a survivor. A man who had been knocked down by life but had kept going. She watched Greg for a long moment, feeling a deep sense of sadness and regret. He wasn't like the others. He wasn't just a homeless man. He was someone who had fought to survive, someone who had lived a full life before everything fell apart. And despite everything, he had not allowed bitterness to take over. The realization hit her like a wave. She had been so blind. She had seen Greg as a problem, a nuisance, but now she saw him as someone deserving of respect. Her heart was heavy, and her stomach churned with guilt. She had no idea what it had taken for him to get here, to this point in his life. And now, she wanted to do something, anything, to make it right. Emma couldn't shake the feeling of guilt that had been growing inside her. The more she thought about Greg's story, the more she realized how deeply wrong she had been in her treatment of him. The man she had humiliated earlier wasn't just a homeless person. He was someone who had lost everything, someone who had faced unimaginable pain, and still managed to keep going. She had to make things right. She knew she couldn't let the day pass without apologizing, without acknowledging the hurt she had caused. Emma took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. She walked toward Greg's corner, her heart pounding in her chest. She hadn't planned what to say, but she knew she needed to say something. When she reached him, Greg was sitting quietly, as he always was, staring down at the floor. He didn't look up when Emma approached, but she could see the faintest hint of recognition in his tired eyes. "Hey," Emma began softly, her voice shaky. "Greg, right?" He looked up slowly, and Emma immediately felt a wave of regret wash over her. He didn't seem angry or resentful. Instead, there was a quiet sadness in his gaze, almost as if he expected nothing better from her. "I'm really sorry for how I treated you earlier," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was rude, and I shouldn't have said the things I did. I didn't understand. I didn't know your story, and now I realize I've been really unfair to you." Greg's eyes softened as he looked at her. He didn't speak at first, just nodded slowly, as if processing her words. Emma waited, unsure of what to expect, but hoping for something, anything, that could make up for her mistake. "It's okay," Greg said quietly, his voice warm but tired. "People don't always understand. It's all right." Emma felt the tears well up in her eyes. She hadn't expected him to forgive her so easily, but he had, and that made her heart ache even more. He wasn't angry. He wasn't resentful. He had just accepted everything, including the way people treated him. And in that moment, Emma realized just how strong Greg was, stronger than she could ever imagine. As Emma finished her shift, she glanced over at Greg one last time. He was getting up slowly, gathering his things in a quiet, almost ritualistic manner. His face was weary, but there was a quiet dignity in the way he moved. It was as if he had nothing left, yet he carried himself with a kind of strength that made Emma's heart ache even more. She watched as Greg began to walk away, blending into the crowd with a sense of purpose. He didn't ask for anything else. No more help, no more pity. He just walked, silent, calm, and dignified. Emma stood there, rooted to the spot, her thoughts racing. She had tried to make amends, but in the end, it wasn't her apology that mattered most. It was Greg's quiet strength, his ability to carry on despite everything he had lost. As he disappeared from sight, Emma wiped away a tear, feeling something shift deep inside her.